land of the free, and home of the brave. May God bless these United States of America. I remember a time where I was in school, when genuine patriotism still thrived. Elementary classrooms still taught us what it meant to be an American. This was about 2005, and things have changed. I remember how our national anthem not only gave me chills, but I could feel the American spirit. When I was in a ROTC, Proud to be an American, by Lee Greenwood, constantly rung from the loudspeakers and became a reminder of the American spirit. I can say for certainty I know the real identity of our country, because I had learnt it. I had lived it. But most of all, I had felt it. Which goes to show how much it breaks my heart seeing that spirit woefully and purposely shattered. Who are we now? We can't say Americans without the accusation of arrogance. We're told pride in our country is dangerous and that patriotism is oppression in disguise. You're not allowed to have pride in your country because, like every other nation, we have a dark past. The transatlantic slave trade. But let's not pretend it was exclusive to 1700s America. If we condemn America alone, then we must condemn every nation that engaged in the same practice. But here's the twist. If every nation participated, then by that logic shouldn't we hate all of humanity? And isn't that what true racism is? Not just hatred of others, but hatred of the human race itself? So who are the real racists? That's a question worth asking. The thing is though, today, I'm diving into our American Constitution starting with the First Amendment. But I want to mention I'm primarily basing my thesis on what these very constitutionally given laws were supposed to do. Not what some politician, justice, lawyer, or SCOTUS interprets, but what the Founding Fathers intended. I admit I'm not infallible, but I'll say again, we have officials who seem more interested in undermining American values than upholding them. Whether you call that betrayal or incompetence, the results speak for themselves. What is the First Amendment of the United States of America's American Constitution? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The literal word of the American Constitution of the United States of America. However, there is some niche and nuance regarding it that should be addressed. What the Founding Fathers gave us was a blueprint, not a finished product. Our responsibility is to preserve it where it holds strong and reinforce it where modern threats have found cracks. What's this niche I mean? Some claim the First Amendment enables harm, that protecting speech suppresses so-called marginalized voices. However, that argument only makes sense if you believe censorship protects people more than liberty does. Beyond that, we also have people who want to control speech because their feelings are hurt, or otherwise an activist desire to control people at the expense of America's core identity in our freedom of speech. If anything, the only solution without becoming tyrannical or hypocritical is put into law protecting the First Amendment in any way possible. What's this law? A form of practice what you preach concept. If you publicly advocate to silence others, maybe you forfeit your own right to speak. Not as revenge, but as a reminder. Free speech must be upheld by those who benefit from it, or they're not really believers in it at all. Hypocritical? More like protectionist intent. The idea of allowing someone to upsert the very law that guarantees our right to a voice to be dissolved because someone says so is by all means anti-free speech, and should be labeled for what it is, insurgency. Specifically, ideological and legislative insurgency. Then again, said insurgency has only recently become a precursor to armed revolt given they torch and firebomb private properties and beat people for the sake of it. It's not hypocrisy. It's protecting the very laws we are supposed to live by. So how is all of this relevant? The American Constitution in 1797 wasn't just a piece of paper. Neither was it legislation giving permissions to its people. It was designed with the purpose and intent to tell the government of the people explicitly what they can't do. As such, technically, every ratification to the law regarding speech that regulates some way to criminalize or penalize people from saying anything is by definition unconstitutional and illegal. And to that degree, those who knowingly craft or enforce laws in clear violation of the Constitution are not just breaking the law. They may be committing acts that echo sedition or ideological betrayal of the Republic. Treason is defined narrowly in our Constitution, but betrayal of the public trust doesn't need to be armed to be dangerous. It's not an individual silencing some stranger from saying something. It's a government entity or body infringing on your right to a voice. As it's a countrywide crime, every American has been made a victim of that tyranny. Are there some words you really shouldn't say? Like yelling fire in a crowded theater? Sure. However, remember this. Give an inch, and they'll take a mile. But the infamous fire in a crowded theater line? It's a quote from a ruling that was eventually overturned. Why? Because the court recognized that restricting speech based on vague danger leads straight to tyranny, and yet even with that precedent gone, the excuse still lingers like smoke. And now, we face either enabling speech that can and does actually do harm, or become the tyrant. So what's the solution here? To ratify the First Amendment to say this instead. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, except where such speech is knowingly and demonstrably intended to cause direct, imminent and unlawful harm, or to incite chaos through deliberate falsehood, and where such harm is not based on offense, criticism or disagreement. Combine this with my theoretical practice what you preach, you get a combination of anti-tyrannical congressional legislation and clearer lines between protected and unprotected speech. However, even for me, this amount of change isn't enough. How so? Add in another theoretical legislation, American Protection Against Tyranny Act. I'll dive into this theory at the end of the video to further elaborate on my point. But let's be honest. Even the clearest laws are meaningless without teeth. That's where the American Protection Against Tyranny Act comes in. Not to restrict liberty, but to make it bulletproof. Beyond that, I have a better alternative than assimilation or tyranny. Ratification of the First Amendment once again, this time to say this instead. Congress shall make no law establishing a national religion or giving preferential treatment to any religious institution. Nor shall it prohibit the peaceful exercise of individual religious belief, provided such belief does not infringe upon the rights, freedoms, or safety of others as secured by this Constitution. Freedom of religion is one of the least examined yet most complicated rights in the First Amendment. We accept that Americans have the right to believe whatever they choose. But what happens when certain beliefs, if taken to an extreme, call for violence or persecution? That's where legal protection ends and public safety begins. I'm not here to attack anyone's faith. But it's fair to question, what do we do when two belief systems fundamentally oppose each other? When one belief calls for exclusion or worse of people from another? This isn't about Muslims, Christians, or any group in particular. It's about how we preserve freedom while preventing harm. America was founded by people of faith, mostly Christians. But the Constitution wasn't written to enforce Christianity. It was written to make sure no one religion ruled over others. Freedom of religion meant Catholics, Protestants, Jews, deists, and later all other faiths could worship without fear as long as their practice didn't violate the rights of others. That's where Americanism comes in. Not as a religion, but as a shared social contract. It means we agree to live under the same laws and principles, even if our beliefs differ. You can believe what you want, but you cannot use your religion to justify breaking the law or threatening others. That's not tyranny. That's balance, the cornerstone of liberty. Already the First Amendment sounds long-winded and complicated. But that's because people are complicated. And today, it feels like most folks can't even read the amendment, much less understand it. American education? I argue it's been on a slow, deliberate decline for over 200 years. Let me explain. About 12 years ago, I was assigned a book project in school. That book? Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. It's a story about censorship. A future where books are illegal and burned. Where children grow up memorizing entire books, word for word, just to keep knowledge alive. Now here's the twist. That same book? It's been banned at different times in America for communist undertones and in China for being too American. Think about that. A book about banning books gets banned. If that's not dystopian irony, I don't know what is. Technically, it was challenged for its depiction of burning the Bible. But let's be real, it was an excuse. When a society bans a book that warns about censorship, you're not protecting anyone. You're proving the book right. And here's where it hits harder. Our country isn't even 300 years old, and we've already started erasing the very ideas that could save us. We censor speech, silence dissent, and now, we tell kids to memorize what's safe, not what's true. Let's not pretend Fahrenheit 451 was a one-off either. Uncle Tom's Cabin was banned in the South for exposing the horrors of slavery. To Kill a Mockingbird gets banned for being too uncomfortable. Maybe that's the point. Maybe discomfort is how we grow. Moreover, 1940s to 50s then came the Red Scare, where being accused of thinking the wrong thoughts could get you blacklisted, fired, or dragged before Congress. It didn't matter if it was true, but only that someone pointed their finger. 1917 to 1918? During World War I, just handing out anti-draft pamphlets could land you 10 years in prison under the Espionage Act. Free speech? Not if Uncle Sam didn't like what you were saying. 1798. The First Amendment had barely dried on the parchment when in 1798 we passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, making it illegal to criticize the government. You could literally be arrested for printing a bad headline. So much for freedom of speech, huh? As you can tell, this problem has persisted since the birth of our country. Getting back to the First Amendment, most debates center around free speech and religion. But there's another part that's just as abused today, the right to peaceably assemble. Let me be blunt. Blocking traffic by gluing yourself to highways, throwing tomato paste on priceless artifacts, cementing your hands to the pavement or looting stores in broad daylight and calling it activism. That's not protest. That's chaos. The First Amendment protects your right to assemble, not your right to endanger public safety, destroy history, or trample on your neighbor's livelihoods. The spirit of that right was always about gathering against power, not against the people. Show up at the courthouse, stand in front of Congress, and hold your signs high. But when you turn protest into disruption for its own sake, you're not using your rights. You're abusing them. As a result, I'm tempted to suggest a third ratification of the First Amendment, this time to draw a clear legal line between peaceful assembly and blatant disruption. But here's the problem. If we hand that power to the government, where do they stop? Would showing up at a courthouse, waving a sign, or speaking out against policy be labeled disruption? Some say that already happened on January 6, 2021. Yes, that day was chaotic, and yes, some people went too far. But to pretend the entire crowd of tens of thousands was one violent mob, that's a blatant lie. We've all seen the footage. Some were escorted inside. Others clashed. It was messy. It wasn't black and white. Now compare that to the mostly peaceful protests of recent years where buildings burned, homes were firebombed, businesses looted, and lives were lost. And still, many turn a blind eye, or worse, defend it in the name of justice. Maybe when someone like Kyle Rittenhouse gets legally acquitted for defending himself, it's not just about legality. Maybe it's a warning. When protests turn to violence, someone's going to get hurt. So ask yourself, are you actually standing for something or just fighting to win your tribe's culture war? I know earlier I wanted to dive into this Americans Against Tyranny Act, and given this is near the end of the video, I'm going to talk about it here. Mainly it's a hot topic because ideally, to include my practice what you preach concept, as well as expand the definition of treason and the death penalty. So what's my proposition? Let's start with what I call the practice what you preach edict. If you support the First Amendment, then that support only counts if your speech promotes liberty. The moment your speech actively infringes on the rights of others, you forfeit your own right to speak. It's that simple. This principle applies to every part of the First Amendment. Take religion. If you're forcing someone into or out of a faith, you violate their liberty. And by doing so, you lose the privilege of your own religious protections. So yes, if a Christian forces someone to be Christian, they should be publicly barred from practicing that faith. And if a militant atheist tries to ban religion entirely, then they too should be legally enrolled into a faith-based institution. Not as punishment, but as a lesson. This isn't tyranny. This is a reminder. Your rights end where someone else's begin. Same goes for peaceful assembly and protest. We already know the line between a protest and a riot, but let's break it down. If you're out chanting to abolish the police, then don't expect 911 to pick up when you call. You wanted a world without cops. Own it. If you demand federal health care because you hate private hospitals, then don't get upset when you find yourself bumped down the list for treatment. You prioritized universal access, and now you're a number like everyone else. And if you loot stores, torch cars, and call it activism, then when your house gets looted or your car gets smashed, don't act shocked. Because under this principle, you are legally bound to live by the very same standards you impose on others. That's what it means to practice what you preach. And now, here comes the more controversial part, the Americans against tyranny concept. Imagine this. A bill gets passed and buried within it is unconstitutional legislation. Not mistakenly, but intentional subversion of the Constitution. Under this act, every government official who voted in favor of that bill would be charged, tried, and if convicted, receive one sentence: death. The law in question? Immediately suspended until rewritten to eliminate the unconstitutional language. And so what's the point of this act? Simple. Americans against tyranny is not just a policy, it's a weapon against corruption. It's a firebreak against lobbying influence, backdoor deals, and authoritarian creep. It reinforces the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights and protects itself from being dismantled. Here's what I mean. This act is permanent. No official, no committee, no branch of government can amend, weaken, or repeal it without committing treason. Why? Because when you try to water it down, what are you really doing? You're protecting your own power, not the people's rights. You don't want to be held accountable. You don't want consequences for tyranny. You want unchecked control without fear. Well, if you're afraid of being held to the Constitution you swore to uphold, then get out of office. Get out of America. With Americans against tyranny, your political corruption ends. And our liberty begins. Tyrants die so that the republic can live. And American prosperity rises in their place.